So welcome to another exciting episode of Group Dog on Demand, and today we're going to be dealing with Wabby's question about the death of Agrippina, that is the attempts on her life and the manner, motive and impact of her death. These are actually two separate content points, but really they fit together, so I thought I'd just deal with them all in one hit. Thing is, remember that when Agrippina was younger and she was pregnant with Nero, an oracle told her that she would die at the hands of her son. And allegedly, she's supposed to have said, "Let him kill me so long as he rules." And that really pretty much sums up Agrippina's approach to her life and her death. So before we begin, I actually want to look at Nero's motives, and these have been, the subject of so much controversy over the years. But I've broken it down into the 4 A's. Okay, so we've got, and when I say mens rea, that's actually the legal term for motive, and it technically translates to guilty mind. And certainly looking at what Nero does after Agrippina's death would certainly indicate that he had a guilty mind. But the 4 A's are, and you can choose to approach this in any way. This is just the approach I've taken. Is Agrippina her parent influence? She was a genuine threat to Nero on a number of levels. There's the acte and Poppaea thing, the interference with love. There's Nero's age and Agrippina's age, and also there's Nero's commitment to his art. So let's investigate those. Firstly, in terms of Agrippina's parent influence, it needs to be remembered that she had been Empress and Augusta during the time of Claudius. And so, you don't just stop being that and doing that when your husband dies. She's now, to add to her list of titles, priestess of the cult of the divine Claudius. So she does have, significant political sway. She's also got palace in tow. She's, got a number of senators who she has relations with in terms of client-patron relationships. There's also her friendships with sort of significant women. So it's not like she's some shy, retiring butterfly. She is out there, she is active, she is wealthy, she is powerful. The thing is that, ultimately Nero sees her as a threat, and he says this to the Senate in his in the letter that he or Seneca wrote after the death of Agrippina, excusing her death, saying that she demanded a share in power. That is, that she wanted power for herself. Catherine Edwards, who is she writes about the death of Agrippina in a different sense, looking at the whole notion of death in ancient Rome. She says something quite interesting, that her goal is to make her son emperor, but when that is achieved, she becomes vulnerable. And when you think about it, it's right. That's a really interesting thing to think about, because she strives her whole life to be safe, to secure the throne for Nero. She gets the throne for Nero, and what next? So it's almost like she doesn't have a continuing goal. She wants to retain power for herself, but in terms of her influence over Nero, that can only last so long. We know from Tacitus and Suetonius that, when Nero started sort of pushing Agrippina away, she threatens him and says, "I'm going to choose Britannicus." And we know what happens then. Britannicus dies. Whether or not he's poisoned or has an epileptic attack, we're never going to know. But he dies at a very convenient time, and, Nero takes the credit for his death. So that removes one possible ally and source of power for Agrippina. Don't forget too, though, she's incredibly popular with the Praetorian Guard, because she is Germanicus's daughter, and also because the Praetorian Guard have done very well under Agrippina, and Claudius, so they are quite loyal to them. And remember, the Praetorian Guard isn't just loyal to the emperor. The Praetorian Guard are loyal to the imperial family. There was also the alleged plot with Rubellius Plautus. Remember, that was the man that Agrippina was supposed to be plotting to overthrow Nero. And she has that court case where she argues, why on earth would I do that when my son is the emperor? Trevor Luke, who also writes about the death of Agrippina, says that she was too potent a dynastic, religious and national symbol. So she is a threat in that sense that, she's on coins, she's on statues, she's in Rome, she's in the provinces, she's everywhere. And we see that too, that even though she might be physically removed from Rome and the palace after 55, 56, we know that she's still mentioned in oaths in the army and Praetorian Guard in 57 and 58, and she's still showing up on provincial coins. So there is still that ripple effect of influence that she has. So it's not like she can be easily or swiftly removed. This was going to take some thought. And also the fact that she is on those coins, she is on those statues, she still has that influence, she's still in the oaths, means that she's still conscious in people's minds. And that, Nero, as emperor, wants people's minds to be on him. Another interesting thing, and this is put forward by a couple of historians, that after the boating accident, people hear about it and they run down to the shoreline, or they run to her villa, and in show of support of Agrippina. So even the common person feels a connection to the emperor's mother, and so this no doubt undermines Nero's attempt to be popular with the Praetorian Guard, with the army, with the senators. So all these things show her power and influence, which could be seen as a genuine threat to Nero's. Because remember, Nero's only 17, through to 22 in that 5-year period. Then there's the Actae and Poppaea thing. Now, this is one of the typical Tacitine narrative approaches, saying that Agrippina was an interfering mother and she couldn't let well enough alone and so forth. But perhaps there's a little bit more to the story. We know that Actae was used by Seneca to inform Nero that there were rumours of incest between him and Agrippina, and that this kind of frightens Nero because he knows that the Praetorian Guard won't stand for that kind of malarkey, and so he starts avoiding her. So we see Actae being used as a political animal by Seneca, and so she's not just as innocent as she may appear. We do know that Actae is the one who does remain loyal to Nero and sticks by him even after his death in 69. Barrett implies that Actae was also more than a passing fancy, and that Agrippina actually saw her as a genuine threat to Nero's marriage to Octavia. Remember, Agrippina had worked very hard for that marriage to Octavia, and she wanted it to succeed because it would join the two branches of the family together. However, remember, by this stage, Octavia hadn't been able to present Nero with a son, and so that was problematic. So there is this idea that he may be looking elsewhere for someone to produce a successor for him. And so there's this idea that Agrippina calls Actae her daughter-in-law the maid. So she may actually be hinting at the fact that there's something quite deep between Actae and Nero. De la Boudoyer, who wrote two texts on this period. One's called Domina, about imperial women, and one about the Praetorian Guard. He states that basically Agrippina and Poppaea are very similar. They both want power, but as women they can't wield power themselves. They have to do it through Nero. And so they basically have, their fight isn't over Nero so much as the power he represents. Dio, who's a couple of centuries later, claims that Poppaea was jealous of Nero's new mistress, who resembled Agrippina, and thus instigated the murder for that reason, because she didn't want to be reminded of her mother, her lover's mother in that sense. And Dawson in 1969, now this is just a bit of a crazy theory, but he's gone into a lot of detail in it. He basically says that Otho, who was Nero's friend and Poppaea's husband, was actually conspiring with Agrippina to overthrow Nero, and divorce Octavia and marry Agrippina so that he could become emperor. And he goes into this whole chronology about it and so forth. But it is interesting to show that, there's more going on behind the scenes than we really realise. It's not just about love, it's also about power and possibly conspiracy. There's also the issue of age, and we've talked about this in class, I know, but the idea that, he's 17 when he comes to power, and he's 21, 22 by the time he murders Agrippina. And so he's a young man trying to establish his identity, his role, his principate, etc. And that quote from Tacitus, finding her intolerable, he decided to kill her. I mean, how many teenage sons that goes, "Oh, Mum, I'm going to kill you." They don't mean it. Nero's just at that point in time where he's obviously getting frustrated with his mother. Again, this feeds into that Tacitine narrative, so it can be used, but don't dwell on it. But also this idea that, when Nero becomes princeps, he doesn't really understand the extent of his power, but as time goes on and he starts to realise just how much power he has and what he can get away with, as de la Boudoyer says, he gravitated from one crime to the next, eventually reaching a position that would have seemed unimaginable at the start. So it's almost like, he starts off with something little, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger until killing his mother doesn't seem such a big step after all. And finally, there's the idea of his art. We know that Nero was, he loved singing, he loved playing his lyre, he loved acting, and he assumed the stage. But all of this happens in public after the death of Agrippina. He may have indulged in private, but certainly no public performances. But we know that after his mother's death in 59, he actually takes to performing on the stage. And interestingly, some of the people he decides to play are quite interesting characters. So, for example, Orestes, a bit of a complicated story, but you remember Agamemnon, king of Mycenae. He goes over to the Trojan War, gets back, and finds that his wife Clytemnestra has been having an affair, and Clytemnestra kills Agamemnon. Orestes is their son, and so he attempts to he does kill his mother for revenge for his father, and the gods are on his side. And we also see Nero playing Oedipus, who sleeps with his mother and kills his father in ignorance, not knowing who they are at the time. And so this idea that he tends to identify with these troubled son characters who end up having very violent relationships with their parents was at the time very much commented on, that he was taking this. So the idea that he was using his art almost as a form of therapy, perhaps, or a way to kind of get it out of himself, is quite interesting. But remember, he was an artiste, as we've talked about, and he obviously wouldn't have been allowed to pursue that if Agrippina was still alive. Again, that's only a little thing, don't make too much of it, but it's something to think about. Just in the background there, before I move on, that is actually the floor from the settlement at Baiae, which is on the Bay of Naples, and was a really luxurious hotspot for Roman nobles, sort of, even better than Herculaneum. And some of it is actually sunk to the floor of the Bay of Naples. And so, it's quite possible that Agrippina could have crossed this floor, or Nero could have crossed this floor. So, in terms of attempts on her life, what do we see? Suetonius states that there were 3 attempts with poison, but after that Nero abandoned it because he realised that they were having no effect, as Agrippina had been taking antidotes. Tacitus, however, states that Nero decided against poison from the outset because he knew his mother had developed an immunity through taking these antidotes. There's also a story about a collapsing canopy on a bed. Now, these stories are quite interesting. Suetonius says that the collapsing canopy, it was like lead-lined and it was supposed to collapse, happened in her villa. And it didn't work because the sides of the bed were too high, and so it was sort of just formed like a little box. However, Tacitus says that that collapsing boat also had a collapsing canopy bed thing. So, and most modern historians discount this story as fantastic and silly. And the third story which we know about is the gift of the boat from Nero, which was adjusted to collapse when rammed. And this was devised by Anicetus, who was head of the fleet at Misenum, Pisa, where Misenum staged the rescue of Pompeii. And he was a former tutor of Nero who hated Agrippina, and the feeling was mutual, but we never really know why. So, in terms of how she actually dies, Nero invites Agrippina to the festival of Minerva in March at his villa at Baiae, and according to all accounts, it's a wonderful reunification. They're very affectionate with each other, and then it's late at night. She sails back to her villa at Boli, and this would have been common at the time because it would be much quicker to travel by boat than travel by litter. The boat collapses, and she survives and swims to safety. She sustains a small injury from an oar on her shoulder. But remember, when she was in exile at Pandataria, she's sent to dive for sponges and becomes an excellent swimmer. So exile actually comes back to help her in the end. She sends her messenger, Agrippinus, to tell Nero of her safety, and another servant to find Acaronia's will. Acaronia is the servant who is on the boat with her, who was clubbed to death as a result of saying, I'm Agrippina. So even at this point in time, she's thinking about money. Interesting, and the sources are pretty much convergent on that. Agrippinus turns up to Nero to say, Agrippina's okay, give thanks for her deliverance. A sword is thrown down in front of him, and he's accused of trying to kill Nero. And in the meantime, Anicetus and some soldiers burst into Agrippina's chamber and club her about for a bit. And then she does the strike me here, for this is the womb that bore Nero. And then they stab her. Where was Nero while all this was happening? Well, Otho, it's suggested by Suetonius that Otho has Nero at dinner at that time. Catherine Edwards, I've talked to her about her a little bit before, she actually sees Agrippina taking control of her own death, challenging her killers where to strike. So she doesn't run away. She doesn't say how to do it. She says, all right, if you're going to kill me, do it this way. Do it right. So even at the point of death, she's still taking control. In terms of the impact of her death, okay, now this is not a statue from ancient Rome. It's actually from 19th century Italy, but it's a veiled statue, which I'll get onto in a little bit, which is kind of relevant to Agrippina. Nero, once she's dead, Nero turns up, he examines her body and says, oh, look, her left forearm's very nice, and I like her left calf. Not that specific in the sources, but you get the idea, which would indicate that he hasn't seen her naked, and the incest stories are complete codswallop, as we've talked about. Her body was then burned on its couch, and then her ashes were interred near Julius Caesar's villa at Misenum. So she's remember when Germanicus was brought back and even Agrippina's ashes were brought back, big triumphs, big processions, none of that. Buried basically dead in a ditch. Nero escapes to Campania for several months and he has nightmares that his mother is haunting him. In terms of the medium term, okay, so once things sort of die down a little bit, he returns to Rome under triumphal conditions. Senators line the streets, the people line the streets. It's almost like he's survived, complete betrayal. And we know that this has all been set up by the Praetorian Guard, by the Senate, by the Seneca, etc. He reads out a letter to the Senate, and Tacitus goes into great detail about how ridiculous the letter is. But basically, he says that Agrippina tried to take power and tried to have him killed. And people pretty much go, yeah, whatever, roll their eyes, but what can they do? This is a man who is willing to kill his mother. So they can't really, this is beyond horrors, because remember the Roman taboo about matricide, so parricides, the people who actually killed their parents were sewn in bags with kittens and dogs and snakes and things and thrown in the river because they weren't worthy of being buried or weren't worthy of being cremated. And so this idea that, if he's willing to kill his mother, then don't mess with him. Agrippina's birthday is declared a day of ill omen by the Senate, and all her statues are taken down, except for one which is veiled with a cloth, hence the picture on the other page. And it's basically say, I'm ashamed of you, Nero. And so this idea that, we're getting enough evidence from here, there's evidence to show that there was a lot of graffiti, there was some public poetry recited, taking digs and pot shots at Nero. So it's not like this blanket acceptance, but it's not at the upper echelons. Most of the senators are playing fair and just going along with it, but it's niggly bits amongst the people that are having, who are having issues with their emperor having killed his mother. In terms of long term, and that is a painting of the death of Nero, but the idea that the supposed quinquennium of Nero, the 5 good years, is now over, and we'll see the declining influence of Boris and Seneca by 62, and even further. Nero pursues his dedication to the arts, and I talked about Orestes and Oedipus. And Champa makes this idea that Nero himself are not his enemies who chose to mythologize the murder of his mother. So it's kind of like, out of all the characters you can play, you play mother killers. So quite interesting there. Also, another long-term impact is one of the members of the Piso conspiracy, Subrius Flavus, actually says that he never forgave Nero for killing his mother, and that was one of his reasons to get involved in that conspiracy. And so that's, we're seeing that even in the long term, that's how people perceive Nero. It's also interesting to note that the way she was killed was so horrifying that no woman really, wanted to take over this kind of power until the Severan dynasties of the 2nd to 3rd centuries. So interesting to think about. So ultimately, what are the things to be thinking about? And there's our lovely Nero neckbeard. Basically, Tacitus uses Agrippina to take shots at Nero. Remember, that's what the ancient writers do. They take pot shots using the women in the men's lives to show that they can't even control their own household. How the hell can they control the country? He frames the narrative around his youth, depravity, and principate. Nero is a bad princeps, thus, he was born of a bad mother, etc. Suetonius uses Agrippina to take shots at the principate in general, as well as having some salacious gossip. Historians now generally refute the traditional Tacitean narrative of why Nero killed him because of Actaea and Poppaea, etc. But there's still no consensus on why, why he would do that. They also refute the drama of the collapsing boat, saying that it's just too theatrical. How on earth would Nero be able to develop such a plan and develop such a boat without Agrippina hearing about it? Good, interesting point. But they do concede that there was probably a genuine collision or capsizing of the vessel, which led people to come out and Nero to realise that, just how popular she was, which was really the cause of her death. They do agree that there was a change in Nero's principate after her death, but they vary on the extent to the impact. Okay. So if you get a question on, the manner, motives of her death, you can say, this is the accepted Tacitean narrative, however, or you could say, these are some of the possible reasons which oppose the traditional Tacitean narrative. You could talk about how the sources don't agree with one another and how even today, modern historians can't reach consensus on why and how Agrippina was killed. We all know about the end stabbing bit, but we don't really understand all the bits leading up to it and whether or not the chronologies agree. So that's our second video. I'm not sure which one we'll be onto next. Probably something to do with the Julio-Claudian principate and the army, and we'll see how we go. Thanks for joining me.